Hi, my name is Spencer, and I'm a video editor living in England. As you might tell from my voice, I'm not originally from there. I grew up in California, and I miss my family very much. So much, in fact, that I regularly stay up pretty late on Friday nights so I can see them through video calls. And to keep myself occupied while waiting for the calls to begin, I decided to start live streaming some acoustic virtual concerts a little while back. Music, however, is something that I'm relatively unskilled at, so I decided to put my technological skills to use and at the very least make my live streams a little nicer in one way or another. I've been treating it as practice, so I can get better at two skills at once and make a portfolio piece to prove I have what it takes to be a contestant on the next season of Project Runway. So here's the mission statement: improve my music live streams and build my portfolio by coming up with an aesthetic and building motion graphics to support it. Let's go! This November marks the 26th anniversary of the launch of Geocities, a website that is amongst the first historically significant places on the internet. Geocities was a web hosting platform and content management system that allowed people to create their very own websites, like the first Squarespace or Wix. While Geocities and I only existed at the same time for around 9 years, my research into internet linguistics and culture has intersected with the Geocities and Geocities adjacent topics more times than I can count. It is symbolic of the endless creative potential that the medium of the internet held and continues to hold. So I wanted to honor it by making my music live stream themed after late 90s to early 2000s websites. I had learned my lesson after having not done enough pre-production for the prior stream and made sure to plan out my goals ahead of time. The first thing I did was make a change to the camera I stream with. My goal for this stream was to recreate aspects of the late 90s and early 2000s, and the fact of the matter is that today's cameras are a fair bit better than the cameras from back then. When editing on a short film called This Is Not the Rubbish Bin, the production borrowed an old DV camcorder which we used as a diegetic camera for the scene. While handling the files, I took the opportunity to study the camera and the data it produced, and I noticed that it had somewhat ridiculously muted colors. I decided to do some research and learned that accurate colors, especially for consumer-grade cameras, are more of a recent development than I had assumed. So my camera had color sensors that were too good. This wasn't that big of an issue. In previous setups, I just made a lookup table, which is, in the simplest terms, a digital video filter to change the camera's look, and in this case I could just desaturate it a little. However, I had a better idea that would give me some more leeway. In recent years especially, a lot of cameras, even consumer-grade ones, have developed sensors that are in some ways better than the human eye and can capture things with crazy detail. What professional filmmakers do most of the time with that footage is throw another lookup table, or LUT as we call it, on top of it to change the colors to the ones that we can see better. But if you don't, you get something that looks a little like a washed out mess. The colors and the data are still there, we just can't really see it and the screen can't really show it to us. However, to me at least, the way that this footage is washed out happens to look a lot like the way that the colors looked on the DV camera in This Is Not the Rubbish Bin. So I installed some third-party software to my camera to boost its dynamic range, since it's fairly limited by default. To test it, I got into some clothes that looked of the era, set up my camera, and shot some reference footage of me practicing the songs on my set list. It worked out pretty well. The footage was significantly more washed out, and then if I did need to add any additional color grading to it, I would have more information available to grade with. The next thing I did was open the Blender project file I made a few weeks ago for the advertisement graphic for my stream so I could update it. I set up a system in the compositing tab that would compress the image and colors into a believably limited pixel art style. Then, I altered the texture and the colors of the guitar slightly because the model was a little bit unfaithful to the real thing and it had been bothering me. I exported the pixelated version of it and opened up After Effects to begin altering the rest of the advertisement. After crunching a few colors here and there, I decided to run a few test exports with the file format JPEG 2000, which was an image display codec made by the same company that made the original JPEG. If I was to recreate the aesthetic of the early internet, I couldn't have razor-sharp pixels and good anti-aliasing. Compression defined those days, when the thought of an entire terabyte was mind-boggling. And it wasn't enough to merely compress an image, I had to make it look like a JPEG compression. Fortunately, I had experience recreating accurate JPEGs before for a short film I made back at the start of lockdown. My process for this was simple. I exported the footage I used as an image sequence, ran a batch operation to open each image in Photoshop, apply a few filters, and then save as a JPEG with low quality, and then repeat as necessary. Then I would re-import the image sequence and mask around the areas that I needed to look corrupted. For this project, I figured I may be able to circumvent all of that work. After a few tests with JPEG 2000, I eventually found a way to compress a video file in a way that looked authentically like a JPEG, while still maintaining the alpha channel, which allowed me to make the video transparent. Ultimately, I decided not to use it for this particular asset due to a slight aesthetic mismatch, but I knew it would come useful in the future. Now that I had a better idea of what my limitations were, it was time to design the layout. I opened up Clip Studio Paint and got to sketching, using some of the reference and research I found around the web to give me ideas. Since the primary goal of this was a live stream, I couldn't go as wild as I otherwise would have liked to, as I had to keep in mind the objective to place a camera in the middle. Still, I made sure to include certain hallmarks such as a campaign against frames graphic and a group photo of NSYNC. I made 3 screens, one for the main stream, one for if I goof up, and one for when I needed to go AFK. Then, I collected a bunch of reference images of old computer and software user interfaces that I could use to piece together the final composition. This wasn't as easy as it sounds because a lot of image information from those days is, as I said before, fairly compressed. Fortunately, I found a few user manuals for software that gave me a peek at a few generic desktop backgrounds, and using clips and screenshots from those, I began to piece together and faithfully, accurately recreate a pixel-perfect desktop. Now, a few things were obviously out of order. For starters, I had to work in 16:9 aspect ratio, which wasn't necessarily the standard monitor format back then. Also, monitors had gotten a lot bigger and pixels proportionately smaller since then, so scaling up the pixels to recreate what they would have looked like would have been difficult. I elected to work in 720p for this, partially because it would make the pixels look proportionately bigger, and partially because then when I'd scale it up in the end, it would make everything look slightly blurry and wonky, which in this instance is a good thing. In visual effects, particularly for film, a lot of times you're not necessarily recreating a physical thing as you are imitating people's perception of a thing. Since most of the images I could find of these old desktop backgrounds were compressed and blurry and wonky, and the people experiencing it at the time would be seeing it through old, crappy cathode ray tube monitors, giving it those qualities helps the effect to a certain extent. I think of it a little bit like backhand compositing. I decided to make the background out of one of my favorite videos on the internet, and then I made it tile starting from the top right corner.
Come on, Steve. We gotta get out of here. What's the rush?
Then I set up a user interface resembling a cross between one of the oldest video call programs and a modern one, and I got to work designing the websites. Among the common themes I had noted for Geocities sites was an evident disregard for sensible user interface and typeface consistency, tiling backgrounds, and a strange obsession with white actors and musicians. I decided to recreate this as best I could. I'm frequently asked by people, and by people I mean my pedantic friend Alex, why I use Glimpse, an open source fork of the GNU image manipulation program, when I have access to and am fluent in other programs. Clip Studio Paint is a tool that is excellent for drawing and rendering illustrations, and Photoshop is also image editing software that exists. My answer boils down generally to personal preference and precision. As you might notice whilst watching this footage, working in Glimpse gives me easier tools and easier options to make pixel-accurate corrections and markings. My pencil snaps to the grid and I can enable and disable anti-aliasing with the flick of my wrist. I edit screenshots and images very often for my videos, and my goal is for those to be completely indiscernible from a regular screenshot, as I usually find it very distracting when something is obviously fake. I have a lot of practice replicating user interfaces for phones and computers in Glimpse, and it's the program which I feel gives me the highest degree of control over this in the fastest possible way. Moving on to the next website, I decided to make it a little less eye-strainy, though not to say entirely so. This one was devoted to the band NSYNC, anime, and Irish poetry because I figured that was the exact assortment of non-sequitur juxtaposition that would seem authentic. Here, I am saving a picture of NSYNC as a low-quality JPEG several times. Sometimes when baking JPEGs, this is necessary to recreate a more authentic look. True JPEG artifacts are passed down from device to device, with each iteration only ruining it slightly. As time wears on and the compression artifacts begin to become compressed themselves, it calcifies into a nicely ruined image. If you were to compress it all at once, it would still ruin the image, but it wouldn't look the right kind of ruined. After adding in some Irish poetry, I made a few tweaks and adjustments and got ready to move on. Now I wanted to make some sprites to resemble video call buttons for the main screen. In Blender, I quickly fudged a shape to look like a telephone and imported the pixelate compositing feature I made before. I experimented with the shape and lighting for a little bit and decided to throw a grease pencil on top of it to help out. Next, I made a microphone and a small camera-looking object and exported the pixel art. I attempted to insert the images into the glimpse file, but the pixel scaling was a little odd, so I decided to save inserting it for compositing. I closed the project for the day and tested out the assets on a video call, where they seemed to work as intended. The next day, I got started on making the 3D animated GIFs that I wanted to take a prominent display on my Geocities sites. First, I started with the flag. I ran a quick cloth simulation on a PNG of a Union Jack and gave it a slightly metallic look to emulate the jankiness of materials in early 3D software. Then, I imported the pixelation system I used earlier and used it to crush the image down into a small-looking resolution. After that, I figured I might be able to get some mileage out of the other assets I had made previously as well. I did a similar thing for the model of my guitar from the advert, and then decided to make a spinning globe. For the globe, I downloaded a picture off of NASA's website, which I then tweaked in Glimpse to have more prominent colors. Then I angled it slightly to focus on North America, because the internet was heavily Anglo-centric at the time, and let it spin. As an extra touch, I added another white sphere behind it that was slightly larger. I knew once it was rendered as pixel art, only certain pixels of the sphere would appear at once, and the overall globe would look a little bit like someone did a crappy job of removing it from a white background it had previously been on. It could also refer to a common problem with certain early consumer-level 3D programs where they didn't have a good encoder for the alpha channel or anti-aliasing, so it would export with a white background wherever there was a slight transparency. Finally, I made some 3D text. One of the things I don't talk about very often when I document my process for this is the amount of times I go back to previous steps and tweak things along the way. This is a fairly common thing to do in motion graphics in my experience. If you notice that shifting something over as much as, say, a pixel will save you a lot of time and effort down the line, then it makes sense to do that, even if it means re-exporting one or more files. In this case, I noticed that one of the websites wasn't working for me aesthetically, so I decided to go back and add a tiling background with texture that was way too small, since that was something I had seen on basically every other Geocities site I saw. The next thing I wanted to do was make some fake user interfaces for the websites and the media players they used. I knew I had to make 3, one for each website and then one to put in the corner of the other to look like a music autoplay user interface. I began modeling these out of primitive shapes and a few modifiers to recreate the pre-2010-ish aesthetic when people tried to make fully rendered works of pixely art instead of the flat user interfaces with subtle gradients that we see a lot of these days. I made a lot of metallic textures and even went to a little bit of an extra step in making a real LCD screen for one of the players because I could and nobody was going to stop me. By the time I had finished all of this, I was feeling kind of tired and I wanted to start seeing the fruits of my labor. I began importing everything into After Effects, including a clip of Cowboy Bebop I had snatched a little while ago because I knew that anime featured in a lot of certain Geocities cultures. I made a glittery texture, attached it to some text I found at an archived forum, and began rendering everything out with the JPEG 2000 preset I had worked out earlier. With the GIFs nicely compressed and finally moving, I decided to set up my OBS system to see how it would look all together now that I had most of the pieces. This step was fun for me because I finally got to arrange things in the space for the first time and see how they overlap. I also got to do some micro-compositing by making subscenes in OBS with certain assets in them for the purpose of moving windows around the screen without needing to move several assets individually. While setting this up, I discovered that OBS didn't natively support JPEG 2000 files, so I transcoded them into ProRes 4444 real quick and began putting them in. Once all of that was done, I called it for the day and decided to go attend a Cat Meet, a virtual Warrior Cats convention that I had been invited to for a panel.
Okay, so could you maybe tell me a little bit about how you got into doing 3D?
There's this absolute bastard that I knew in high school called Ryan. I think if there's any guy that I could see myself getting settled down and married to, living in a log cabin, just being platonic hetero BFFs for life, it would be this guy. A little while ago, when we got back into touch, he mentioned that he was learning Blender. And he was showing me all the cool stuff that he did in it. And I wanted a way to be closer to my lovely bastard husband. I decided to start learning some Blender as well so that we could have that to talk about a little bit.
Ah, awesome. I can't believe your origin story is like the power of friendship.
I mean, the next day, I got started on some of the finishing touches. I saw that a lot of sites on Geocities had little stickers and text boxes advertising certain browsers, products, or opinions of theirs, and I wanted to recreate them. I made a rudimentary box in Blender and then designed some banners in Glimpse. I brought the banners in, fit them to the box, and began exporting them. After testing them in OBS, I decided to make one more that claimed the website was created in Notepad, which was a source of pride in the days where content management systems were only beginning to be introduced. I point this one out in particular because it's a good example of how you can combine multiple compositing tools in Blender. I wanted an outline for my notepad-like objects, so I outlined them with the Freestyle tool, which then got crunched into the pixel art with my node tree. Once that was done, I designed a visitor counter really quick and one additional animated GIF to fill up the rest of the space. But then I came to a realization. This stream could have the best assets in the world, but if I can't deliver a quality experience, then people would quickly tire of the silly gimmicky visuals and I wouldn't be able to maintain interest for very long. I invented a time machine real quick to go back to the previous Saturday and reach out to some of my musician friends to ask if they could cameo through pre-recorded videos. I also managed to stop the US election tampering that resulted in Violent J and Shaggy 2 Dope being sworn into office. That doesn't happen anymore. You're welcome. I traveled back to the present and received the videos from my friends. I brought them into Premiere and exported one of them as an MP3 for later. I put the other two into After Effects and changed up the colors a little bit to make them look washed out and crappy like most consumer-grade video cameras looked back then. I also updated some of the 3D GIFs that I wanted to change slightly. With those exported, I got to work on the MP3 file. I wanted to turn it into a tribute video, a somewhat common thing from early YouTube where people would make a montage of images of a character set to a piece of music they like. I found a download for an old version of Windows Movie Maker and began learning the interface. Windows Movie Maker, I have to say, unironically blew me away here. I've never worked with a program that has asked me to set the number in megabytes for how small I wanted my video project to be. And for a project wherein I'm constantly compressing to make everything look worse, I absolutely adored this feature. I did have to convert the Windows Movie Maker file into MP4 later, which hilariously raised its file size, but I'm happy to have discovered a setting like that, and I'm curious about the mischief I can get up to in the future with something like that. While I was using third-party software, I also decided to data mosh the Cameo videos a little in another program called AVI Demux, just for the sake of making things interesting. After a few tweaks here and there, I had finally gotten everything together and in working order. I felt a mixture of pride and horror staring at my creation. Normally, at this point, I would be taking a picture of all of the assets compiled together and bringing it into DaVinci Resolve to make a lookup table. But in this particular instance, I decided that it would be better for the art if it didn't have that finishing touch of cohesion that usually does a great job of tying everything together. The early internet was a mishmash of things from all over, and the whole point was that nothing was cohesive. I wanted to preserve that. What I did end up doing, though, was making another LUT for my camera using the footage I took earlier while testing some assets. I wanted the colors to be slightly more desaturated, and I was grateful now that I had even more dynamic range that I could safely ignore to achieve this. With the LUT completed and all of my assets finished, it was finally time for me to stream.
Lend me some sugar, because I'm your neighbor. Alright, here we go. Now shake it, 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 shake it like a Polaroid. Shake it, shake it, shake it. Oh, this is the white boyest thing I've ever done. Like a Polaroid. Shake it, 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 shake it like a Polaroid.
And I had a great time. My friends all enjoyed the cameos and the other videos I had prepared for it, and while I goofed up here and there, I had learned by now to keep playing and pretend that it was intentional. I got to have some fun conversations with the chat and play some thoroughly nostalgic tunes. And of course, I got to show off my excellent Geocities site to my family afterwards during our phone call. Before I close, some final thoughts. I think this is the first stream where I genuinely can't think of a way I might have improved it. Sure, I could have spent more time on things, so I could say I needed to improve my time management, but part of the fun and challenge of these projects is the extremely limited time in which I have to do them. What I had was effective and fun, and in the end nothing was so poor that it ended up ruining the aesthetic I was aiming for. I'm really proud of the lengths I went to achieve this and the dividends that ended up paying off. In the end, I'm really happy and proud about what I accomplished. While this project might not be as exciting to look at as the other ones, which had more work in After Effects and less in image editors, I think I ended up creating something a little special, and I'm glad I've started doing this and putting myself out there to this end.